So anyway, I had this question from Joey, okay? And I didn't know I had it from Joey at that time. I was later to read about in Rudolf Steiner, and particularly in from Buddha to Christ, the lectures that he gave in 1911 about this change of egos thing was part of that. Anyway, so I met Rudolf Steiner and I met his books, and after a while I started to meet the Anthroposophical Society. It actually took me about 18 months or 2 years. I had no idea that there was an Anthroposophical Society. I wasn't aware of it. You know, I was in this wonderful school in Berkeley where everything was there, and the anthroposophists were so hardly there at all that I never noticed their existence. Now, once I knew they were around, I started seeking them out. But anyway, so for 3 years, I just read Steiner and his students, and I read, you know, I had a good fortune that there was a bookstore where the guy that ran this small bookstore called Sunshine Books on, I think it was on Telegraph Avenue, but it might have been someplace else, you know, toward the North Oakland area, out on the edge of Berkeley and North Oakland. But anyway, he was a really curious guy, and he would get these catalogs from Steiner Books and other places, and he would look through them, and he would just buy books on impulse. And he didn't buy all Steiner all the time. He bought in books by, you know, George Adams and other people, and I started buying these other books, these Curtian science books, because they were on his shelves, and they looked really fascinating. So for about 3 years or 3.5 years, I started reading all this Steiner stuff. And then at a certain point, I found myself in the same position I'd been in twice before. That I absorbed this Steiner so strongly. You know, I probably read 50 lecture cycles while I was reading all these other books. That's the only way I could think. I could only think out of Steiner. When I met a situation, when I met an experience in life, I put it in the categories and in the vocabulary and the ideas that I had absorbed through these books. And by that time, that was the third one, you know, that was the third time I came awake to the fact that I did not feel free, and my conscience didn't like it, that I was going around looking at the world through this stuff. So then I went to work to stop it. And it's a colossal bit of work, you know, especially when you have a paradigm like Rudolf Steiner teaches, spiritual science. It just arises out of the soul into your thinking, ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. You can't hardly think outside of it. And it took a lot of work over several months to subdue that natural impulse to see everything in terms of what Rudolf Steiner said. But at the same time, it was very important, very practical, very down-to-earth, very significant work on my own soul life. And I'm very blessed that I had the problem. I would not, for a minute, not want to have had the problem. I think the fact that I had this problem 3 times was very important for my own development. It had to happen. Fortunately, when I incarnated in 1971, I brought an awareness, an inner awareness, such that when I looked at things like this, it disturbed me. So there I was disturbed, and I was finally able to set anthroposophy, or the content of spiritual science, over here. This is my I, this is this content, and if I want to call it to mind, I do that as an intentional act within my own mind. But I'm free before it. And of course, the more I got into the philosophy of freedom, the more I understand that that was one of the things he was talking about. Of course, he's not just talking about that. Part of the philosophy of freedom is understanding the influence of the shadow and all of that, and at that point I had no clue. But nevertheless, I understood that I had to not instinctively or unconsciously think everything through the lens of Rudolf Steiner's world conceptions. So I stopped it. And then once I stopped it, I decided to try to figure out what the heck he was up to. So I started creating in my mind a kind of organism of his thought, the best way I could understand it. Now, of course, I haven't read everything at that point, but a lot of things he repeats over and over again, and you can get general ideas, and I think I had some Stuart Easton books at that point. You know, he's a guy that does history of the world and the history of the society. I think there's 2 books that I'd read by that point. by Stuart Easton. Anyway, so I tried to hold in my mind, and I was instinctively doing Goetheanism at this point, although I didn't precisely understand it, but I was instinctively doing it. I tried to make a picture of Rudolf Steiner's life and work and how that fit in with everything else that I knew about history and existence and spiritual life and everything. And I spent a lot of time thinking about it. It was the main thing I thought about for some time. And at a certain point, after doing this, I came to a particular conclusion. And it wasn't a conclusion that you'll run into in the anthroposophical culture today, because that culture is a little bit fallen, we might say. Now, what was the conclusion? Well, the conclusion was that anthroposophy is not the content of spiritual science, but the cognitive method. It's a method, not a content. And I was pretty sure that I perceived the situation correctly when I tried to arrange in my head how all these different parts of anthroposophy that I was reading, including the philosophical material and the Goethean science and the lecture cycles and all the rest of it, I could fit it together. It seemed to fit. It worked that way for me, and I came to this conclusion. And about a week later, I was visiting a new anthroposophical friend, a man and his wife. We were there, and I was all excited with this. I went and told him that I'd figured this out, that anthroposophy was a method, not a content. And he got up and he went over to his library. Like a lot of anthroposophists, he has a really outstanding, extensive library. Pretty cool thing in a lot of ways. But anyway, he had this great library, and he grabs this book off the shelf, and it's by Owen Barfield, who I think I'd just gotten one of his books. I think I'd gotten through Sunshine Books, Owen Barfield, Speaker's Meaning, and I was trying to penetrate that with my thinking. Anyway, he opens it up, and he finds this page, and he quotes to me Owen Barfield from Dornoch, giving a lecture in Dornoch in 1933, which is a very interesting period of time. And he says from the lectern in Dornoch that anthroposophy is a method, not a content. So you could say that was a confirmation of my own thinking, and it's important in our biography when we get these confirmations. It's not like it's nothing. It's important. So anyway, there I was, and that sort of reoriented me with regard to the society. But as I continued to go to society meetings when it was around, I ended up going to Sacramento and participating up there. Then when I went to New England, I ended up in the Wilton-Limeboro area, and I was involved in things at Pine Hill and high mowing and, the branch work there. And so I'd had more, branch work in Fair Oaks and a little bit of stuff in Berkeley and stuff. And, I had a number of years didn't do many conferences, but there I was, moving around, trying to understand this stuff. Okay. And it was pretty clear, as I observed the group activity, the lecturing and the rest of it, that people didn't understand this. This idea, which seemed to me so central, and which Owen Barfield had confirmed, it wasn't in the vocabulary of anthroposophists at all. They were way over here.